Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to talk a little about investing, specifically the field of responsible investment. Now, responsible investment, or RI, is a term that's tossed around a lot these days, but I think with little understanding of its definition or history. Responsible investment is essentially a collective term used to describe the broad range of approaches that can be used to incorporate environmental, social, and governance considerations into the investment process. So it's not just the financial metrics like you're seeing in this graphic in front of you, but it's also trying to account for some of those qualitative factors as well. Responsible investing became much more formalized and really got its rooting in the 1960s, while North America and Europe underwent a lot of social changes. What was happening with the advent of media, publications about what was happening in Vietnam, radio, television, brought increased kind of global awareness of social injustices across the planet. In addition to Vietnam, I would say more notably, what was happening in South Africa's apartheid, with apartheid practices around segregation, compelled a lot to social unrest and civil disobedience, especially on campuses in North America. Anti-apartheid protests took hold in the 1960s, particularly on the campuses of North American colleges and universities. In this visual here, you have an example of anti-apartheid protesters at UC Berkeley erecting shanties, blockading entrances to the campus. And initially, protesters wanted to end apartheid, but there were not many ways to influence the South African government from North American campuses, especially not using the traditional forms of protest such as picketing or demonstrations. Eventually, members of the college-based anti-apartheid movement devised a bit of a more practical way to enact change by pressuring their universities to divest stocks of companies doing business in the country. The demand from protesters that universities actually divest of stocks from any company doing business in South Africa was no small ask. At one point in the 1980s, between 1/2 and 1/3 of the S&P 500 did business in South Africa, which would place these companies among the best investments in the world at the time. They were blue chip stocks and steady earners that were heavily employed by endowment funds. When selling assets, universities had to pay the same fees and charges that any other investor faces. So with huge amounts of money at stake, it was understandably tough for college financial officials to sell those assets. However, students continued their protests, and eventually college administrators began to reform their approach. The first school to agree to divest its portfolio of companies doing business in South Africa was Hampshire College. By 1988, so it took years, but by 1988, a total of 155 colleges had at least partially or entirely divested from businesses doing operations in South Africa. This then expanded beyond the reach of campuses, and between 1985 to 1990, over 200 US companies cut all ties with South Africa, resulting in a loss of $1 billion in direct American investment. So what was the result in South Africa? Well, the various apartheid codes that segregated the races were eventually dropped. Then different races were given the right to vote, and in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected as the new president. The divestment movement was not the only reason why apartheid ended, but it was a major contributing factor. Today, responsible investment portfolios, it includes both divestments and investments in socially or environmentally responsible companies. Those portfolios oversee roughly $13 trillion in global markets. And next week, I'm going to explore an entirely different avenue, but this one I just wanted to talk a little bit about apartheid and the history of responsible investing and its efficacy that's being kind of witnessed both politically and socially.